1 2 1 2 1 2. 1 2 1 2. Can you turn that off for a sec? Can you just turn that off for a sec? Can you turn the audio off on your on that YouTube?
Sorry, I'm not running it yet.
Yeah, yeah, you are.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Let's pause. Okay.
1 2 1 2. 1 2 1 2 1 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Gerald, can you just take that mic and say a few things?
You need to put it on here, so it's going to be. Oh yeah. Hello. Once upon a time, there were 3 blind mice. See how they run. See how they run. 1 2 3. Yeah. Okay. What happens if you put it here? Once upon a time, there were 3 blind mice. See how they run. See how they run. 1 2 3. 1 2 3. Does that work? Is that very good? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Tell you what, can you take your machine
Yeah.
outside,
Yeah.
see what the sound is like on YouTube?
Yeah, sure.
One two one two 1 2 1 2. I'm hearing it through the. Are you? You. No, do it the other way. You're coming through the speakers for some reason. I just refresh the page, yeah. Okay, 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12. Manishtana Halala Hazar. 1 1 2 1 2 testing. 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. This is a test recording to see if the sound is coming through the microphone on the Sennheiser remote microphone. Attached wirelessly to the Rode to the computer out to the internet out to Is it working or not, Gerald? One two one two 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 Well, there's definitely sound coming out of this.
There was sound coming out, I could hear it.
Okay. One. Why am I getting any? One. 1 1 1 1.
We're going to try and test. getting there. We're getting there.
So have you got a recording of this thing happening?
We took some photos, and so we've got about a 4-minute video of all the photos of the procession, but not the speeches and everything. But I don't know whether we've got someone to do that. But certainly, if you go to the shore website, the homepage, right at the top there's a link. I think they're going to start that out tomorrow in the weekly email.
I'm glad you chose to.
Sam. Now my Belmont.
Oh, so you know Julia Gray?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, very well.
On the way to Australia.
Indeed. Yeah.
And Francis.
Absolutely.
I grew up with those two.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. Very nice. And you're here in Vienna now?
Yes, we've been here a long time.
Oh, okay. So how do you get your name?
D.
Got it. And who are you?
I'm Nell Lawson.
I know.
Oh, no,
How do you do Dominic Mars?
He's running upstairs.
Yeah. My first time here. It's a nice place.
found it okay then.
Oh, well, ways. It's a savior. Yeah.
Are you settling down okay in Belmont?
Yeah, we've been there now coming up to 6 months. So, we took our first Shabbat off 2 weeks ago. So it's been a whirlwind for sure, but,
Yes. Great.
just now starting to learn the community for real.
Yeah.
Because for the first couple months were very nice people. Then they really started to.
You remember how long you were? Melinda died before you got
I was, yeah.
You were here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Her stone setting is coming up soon.
Sorry?
Her stone setting is coming up
I know,
in a couple weeks.
I know.
Yeah.
Russell was over dinner last weekend.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Very nice. So, yeah, no, that was only a few months ago. It was
Do you know what? I can't remember.
4 months? Couldn't have been more than that.
It's not a long time.
It's not.
Yeah, it's not a long time.
No.
Just, we've got Justin with
Yeah. Justin drove Russell to Israel because he said that it was something that he wouldn't normally. They just they get away rather than say with me.
Yeah, and they have a nice farmways.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Julia and I.
Wow. Did you, which cities did you grow up in?
We met at FZY.
Oh, okay. So you didn't grow up in Belmont? I don't know if you should.
I grew up in Windsor. She went to Holland Park.
Okay. That's
My
nice.
party.
Okay.
And I grew up in Brooklyn.
With, no, so we did
Oh,
see
no,
that.
Stephen was Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And so was Francis.
Oh, right.
Yeah. We were all Brooklyn.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, so they've known each other for a long time? They
A
grew up
long
in-
time.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, they're my baba, so.
potatoes. Potatoes, sunny. Give some. Give the meat some. I had to do it yesterday. See if they grow. Oh, dear. That's right. Well, they did in 1840 or so. Very long. Say. Is that all?
You're actually right, they are. No,
That was just my guess.
yeah, it's just,
Where is this? It's pointing at deep.
that's the microphone's there.
The camera.
Is it?
It's pointing.
Oh,
Oh, it's back there.
Yeah, we're trying to put it onto a network at the moment. Yeah, so that's what all this is about. at the moment.
So does Gerald have the link for the?
No,
have a
we're
course on
having
this
some
today.
problems.
He doesn't have my video here.
He's got Neil on the other end of my phone. While they're trying to sort something out.
Important enough.
I think we want
You want to know about distilling, do you?
No, I'm not talking about people.
Oh,
So we can talk about instead of tonight.
oh thank you.
Pharmacist.
From the pharmacy. I went to a distillery once.
Oh yes.
Gin and rum distillery. Really? Yes. In near Stratford-on-Avon. And very interesting. This is what you call a small distillery, not like what they call them.
I know what you mean.
Yes.
Yeah, I know what you mean, but I can't.
So it's a very special sort of things that they use in order to make it. But I didn't realise how complex the actual procedure is. And, if you reckon you distill once, they distill on a continuous cycle and adding in the bits and pieces, the botanics to create them.
But rum, the core ingredient of rum is great. But a rum,
Rum they'll use a grain, and it'll be could be a wheat.
and what was the other thing? This rum and
Gin,
okay, lovely.
basic alcohol is unique. Unique. Neither of which are my drinks. Having said that.
It's not quite as easy as it looks.
People say schmooze to me. I don't understand prepared drop. My lack of communication. Hey, how are you? Good, good. Yeah, good to see you. Yeah. Thank you. She's doing well. Thank God. Will do. Yes. Pardon?
Anna's 16.
Oh, the Chateau, very exciting.
Yes.
When she's due?
End of June.
Very exciting. I think we did actually see her in Hendon at engagement parties. I think. Yeah, very exciting. So, yes.
Looking forward to being grandparents.
I'm sure. Yeah, a very exciting time. Yeah.
Your boys okay?
Thank God they're doing well.
They're growing up fast.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
So I saw them. I saw one at the wedding, at Anna's wedding.
Yes. Yeah.
Saw them properly just after Anna got engaged.
Right.
Came round to your house and saw them at the table.
Yeah.
So what are you doing work-wise?
So most of the time I'm an accountant in the civil service, and then some of the time I'm a rabbi as well. So
Oh, you're at
mix it up.
Northwood
I'm
some
Northwood.
of the time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So when you go there, do you all come over?
We all come over, yeah, for Shabbat. So yeah, we're there like every second Shabbat basically.
Right.
And
Staying
we
in the
all stay. We
flat?
stay in the flat there.
Right.
And then I also go there for Shacharit on Monday and Thursday, which is just me. So, yeah. That's good.
Say hi to Tim.
Will do. Thank you.
But this is definitely a big delay because I just saw my awesome.
Yeah. No, it's got like a 2-minute delay or something. 2 minutes. Well, that's what I'm assuming. It's more than what's happening in the video.
Send it to you. If you've got the link, that would be great.
Do you know what it is? You can type it.
What's that? I don't want to mess around here. I just opened a new tab. It's not like sharing the screen.
It will share the screen, but not yet.
And is it easy to get the projector down? Do you need to turn on the... No, I'm saying, but will it take time? We don't need to. It doesn't take time to warm up. It's alright, and sound is through here. Oh dear. I think this is all down. Not just because of the. Try the other one. Alright, great. Fine. So what do you want to do? Just leave it on there?
When you want it to be shown, press this button, say 1, 2, and off it goes. Try it now. Keep your finger on it, so it should turn right. Push it. So you can see it on the screen. Now press it again. Press it down again, it'll go white. Phone press.
tech doesn't work this
Joe,
well.
do you do
you know.
intros or anything?
I'll do some
Do we have an
intros.
order?
Sam, James, you. How's that? Yeah, sure. I'm going to tell people to have some tea and coffee.
Beforehand.
Yeah, have some tea and coffee.
So let's go. So,
Guys, you want to help yourself some tea and coffee and some cake? Feel free to do so. Plenty of comments. Last chance. Do enjoy, grab a coffee. We're going to try and set up some techie stuff. Do help yourself. Yeah, we're good. It is.
There's a microphone here.
List of jobs for me when I get home.
Yes,
So.
oh yeah.
It's not like the later I stay, the more will get done. It's the later I stay, the later I'll be awake. Yes.
The microphone's here.
Okay, great. I all these comments are not being already.
Disseminate these.
Are you seeing it from here? No, you haven't told anybody. With this experiment.
Oh, I see. Okay, fine.
We won't get a recording of it. So.
If I can text it out now, I can on my broadcast.
Are you speaking from here? You don't
I
play?
don't mind. No, I usually like to stand. Do you have a preference?
For stand, I'll probably stand if that's okay.
If you do stand, if you stand there, it'd be
We
great. But if
voted
you,
between the two of us.
Yeah, we've got majority.
But it will probably rustle as we move. We try not to move the.
yes, I haven't, yeah.
I had.
Not too much.
I used to listen to when I was engaged. Like, why you used to post Sheeran. Not really. I posted them online. It was already online. I used to listen. I used to keep up with Smith online in the UK. And Rush Sheeran was giving Sheeran time to stand at the table. I would like sometimes I would have to learn when it was time to like take them out. Yeah. Sort of feeling coming.
Once we first started James already, when James finished his project,
a minute before, so I should press it a minute before I'm ready. Like in the middle of my...
press it, it's okay, yeah. You're not going to do the show first and then talk.
Correct. It relates to the third part of what I'm talking about.
Okay. As long as there are 4 points.
No, there are not, sorry.
It's before.
Very good.
Yes, nice thing.
Cool.
Thank you. Thank you.
The same with tonics. Not now, no. Anyway, not that great labs
These two have agreed that the format is you stand. You stand there, the mic
Am I
is on.
starting?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, great. Okay.
I'll just introduce you.
Please.
Delighted to welcome three of volume here, two of whom leave no introduction from me as pinner past and present. The third one tells me I should refer to him as Rabbi Sam from Belmont. I'm delighted to welcome him to Pinner, which is via Belmont and originally Chicago. Look forward to hearing from him. The format is going to be, we're going to hear from each of the three rabbis, then we're going to have a Q&A session so you can ask them anything esoteric, more esoteric the better, all about Pesach. Over to you. Just before we start, as you can see, we've been playing around with a lot of electronic toys. We are testing some of the new equipment we put in the shul, the digital comm strategy. So we have a little box up there which will project some stuff that you'll see later on. We also have David who's helping us to live stream this event as a test for future live streaming.
Behind you. Later on, use my watch.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Please don't
Good.
use that clock, otherwise we'll be here for
I'm
next
going to set the alarm for 10 minutes.
Yeah, I got it.
That clock is still on.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam. Thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be here. When Rabbi Ben asked me to deliver the talk, he didn't tell me the time frame. So you're holding a half an hour to 45-minute shir, which we're going to do in 10 minutes. Okay? So 45 minutes is fine. Yeah. So bear with. Also, I apologize for my accent. There's nothing I can do about it. We spilled some tea in a harbor a long time ago, and I ended up there. So bear with me. If you don't understand what I'm saying, raise your hand, ask a question. It's fine. My show does it to me every week, so no need to worry about that. So I thought that we would talk tonight a little bit about framing the entire context of the Seder night. So we know that there are two mitzvot d'oraita, two biblical mitzvot that we perform on Seder night. One of them is eating matzah, which is incredible in and of itself because it's the only mitzvah that we can still do by eating. It's the only mitzvah that we can eat. We don't have korbanot anymore. We don't have truma and meiser. We only have matzah, so therefore it behooves us as a Chazon Ish to take it very seriously. But the other biblical mitzvah, we sort of do it without really understanding its finer points. And that is the mitzvah of the Haggadah itself, of Magid, right? The centerpiece of the Haggadah where we sit there and everybody wants it to end because they're hungry. That is really the second mitzvah, the second biblical mitzvah. And so I thought we would tonight try and delineate a little bit what we are trying to achieve during that hour, 2 hours, whatever it is that we're sitting at a table together discussing the story. Okay? So if you look in source number 1, you'll see that the Rambam, very differently than most other Rishonim, defines the mitzvah not by the verse we would have expected him to use, the verse V'higadat lebincha, and you should tell your son on that day. He doesn't use that verse as the locus of the mitzvah. Where does he find the locus of the mitzvah? In a different verse. Zachor et hayom hazeh asher yetzatem miMitzrayim. You have to remember the day that you left Egypt. Okay? This is very weird. So according to the Rambam, the mitzvah is a mitzvah of remembering. Okay? It's not a mitzvah of telling your children. Telling your children comes into it, and it's important. But the mitzvah is actually not located in somebody else. It's located in you. And he compares it very weirdly, to a similar mitzvah which we do every week. Zachoret Yom HaShabbat lekodsho. You have to remember the day of Shabbat and make it holy. So what is going on here? Why is the mitzvah of remembering the mitzvah that we're doing on Seder night, and how does that work into all of the different aspects of the evening? Let's talk about memory for a moment, okay? Let's say that you get into one gets into a car crash, God forbid, and their car is totaled, okay? Is that a good or a bad event? It's likely to be bad, okay? But I could tell you a story wherein that's actually a good event. Because if I tell you that you got into a car accident and you were completely unharmed, but your car was totaled, so now you have a brand new car, and actually you, Dafka, needed a brand new car right now because the mechanics found out that in 2 weeks' time the car was going to blow up, okay? Then the valence of the event changes. Okay? But how did I change? Where was the valence of the event? The meaning of the event? Was it positive or negative? Where was that located? In the event itself? Or in the story that I told about the event? It's the story, right? It's the story that I told about the event which gave it its meaning. This is exactly the function of memory. Okay? Memory, we like to think of memory, we're remembering things like we're a camcorder, right? There's a little video camera up in the corner and it's recording everything. That's been completely debunked. Eyewitness testimony doesn't remember facts because that's not what we're programmed to do. What do we remember? We remember Seder night is trying to understand, okay, what does Yetziat Mitzrayim mean in my life now? And you'll notice, by the way, that we move in between different apertures. So we have the personal aperture, and then we have the national aperture. And the question is, what does Yetziat Mitzrayim mean to me? And then, what do I mean to the nation? Where do I fit in? And we're looking at these different levels as we go through. And I want to share with you something very, very key in my opinion. And that is that part of this memory that we're keying into, right? So we all think, okay, let's say you only had 5 minutes to do Magid. You only had 5 minutes. What are you going to tell about? Okay? You know that your kid is 5 years old, 10 years old, whatever it is, he's falling asleep in 5 minutes. You have to get it all out. What are you saying? The miracles, right? That seems to be the focus. But look at this incredible Rambam, source number 4. He says, listen, if you have a son, a child, who's only capable of understanding one thing about the Seder night, he's not an intellectual guy, maybe he's not grown up yet and his mind hasn't developed, Maybe he's not capable of understanding what you want to tell him. You have to tell him one thing. And it has nothing to do with the miracles. The miracles are a sideshow. Okay? They're a sideshow. I can make that on my computer screen. What do I tell him? You see that woman over there? You see that man over there? The butler, the maidservant, you see them? We used to be like them. That's what we were like in Mitzrayim. We used to be not in control of our own lives. And now we are. What a wonderful thing. And that's it. And that's where you end the Seder as far as that kid is. What about the story? What about the miracles? What about God's love for? None of that. None of that. Why? Why would that be the case? Why are we focusing on, okay, so we're free, okay, shkoach, but let's splitting up the sea. I mean, that's big stuff. Look, source number 5. The Rambam says, the Rambam's general philosophy about Torah is that Torah, the mitzvot, are there to perfect you as a human being. So he says, well, you could ask me, why not just tell me how you want me to be as a human being instead of giving me all of these tricks? You have to wave a palm branch, and you have to sit in a sukkah, and you have to do all these weird things. But really, you're telling me that they're all there to make me a better person. So just tell me, what kind of person do you want me to be? And I'll be that kind of person. He says it doesn't work like that. Because it's not human nature. He says, I'll prove it to you from the Torah. The Torah says that God didn't lead the Jews out of Egypt derech eretz Pelishtim, through Gaza. Okay? You could have, right? From Egypt up to Gaza, boom, you're in Israel, done. It's a day and a half tops. Okay? He went all the way around. Why did he do that? Because he was afraid that the Jews were going to see the war they were going to have to fight for their lives in Gaza against the Pelishtim, and they run back. So you'll tell me, so okay, but you're God. Just make them not afraid. Tweak them. Says the Rambam, you don't understand. This is the key. Without a freely given relationship from human beings to God, the whole thing doesn't make any bit of difference. The whole point is that we are free to choose not to engage with God. We are free to choose to neglect Him. And yet we don't. That's where the Torah comes in. And that's why, if you skip all the way to the end, when God introduces Himself in source number 10, when God introduces Himself to the Jewish people at the 10 Commandments, how does He introduce Himself? Not, Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher barat haolam, I am God who made the world. What does He say? I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. Why is that relevant to me? Meaning it's important, but there's bigger things you could say if you were going to introduce your... This is the first and only time God spoke to the entire Jewish people. Why is that the focus? Well, it's very simple now that we understand. The whole fulcrum of our relationship with God is our freedom not to engage with God. The freedom that we gained by leaving Egypt to be our own people, not subject to the whims of a master, not subject to being beaten down by Paro or anybody else. And yet we choose to engage with God. That's the important bit. So now we go all the way back to the beginning. I have to remember, have in mind, and remember and work into my identity what it means to leave Egypt. I have to work into my identity and understand and remember leaving Egypt. What does it mean to me? And what am I going to choose to do with that freedom? Thank you very much.
Sam, it's nice to be back in Pinner. I was marking, thank you. I was marking the last time we were here was 4 years ago. We said we'll come back soon, and this little thing called coronavirus happened, and now we're back. So it's very sort of emotional to be back and see everyone. So thank you very much for having me. And Judith sends her regards as well. Sam, obviously Gerald gave us this message that we're going to do a pre-Pesach schmooze. Sam's interpretation was he should do a 45-minute share. My interpretation was it's a schmooze, so I didn't prepare anything. So if you think of the 4 sons in Pesach, the wise son, the wicked son, I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about which son is which. But I'll do a bit more with the schmooze, so maybe we'll make it a little bit interactive. Which is, I guess, the first question, which seems to be a very obvious question, the simplest question you could ask any child, which is, what are we supposed to be doing on Pesach? What are we remembering on Pesach? Can anyone give me an answer? Very straightforward question. What's Pesach all about?
Yetziat Mitzrayim.
Yetziat Mitzrayim. Okay, going out from Egypt. Do you want to elaborate?
2 nominal mitzvot have to be completed. Yetziat Mitzrayim, matzah, job done.
Well done. You were paying attention, so that's very good. So it's all about the exodus from Egypt, remembering slavery. And that seems to be what the Torah tells us, right? You should remember the day you went out of Egypt. But I'm going to ask you another question, which is, who can remember, you've got to think back 51 weeks now, who can remember Seder night from last year? Hopefully you can remember. Very good. Seder night from last year. And what things do you remember from the Haggadah, from Seder night? Anyone shout out, what things that you remember from last year that you did on Seder night? Manishtana. Very good. Echad mi yodea. Right, who is one? One is God. Manishtana, the question, why is this night different from all other nights? Any other suggestions? What was the key takeaway from you from last year that you remember? Pesach Matzah Mara, Rabban Gabriel. Very good. The 3 things you have to say. Anything else? From the Seder. Dayenu, yeah. Dayenu, the songs, right? The songs we remember. Echad mi yodea, Dayenu. Manishtana with the kids.
Is it finishing soon?
Finish. Very good. So we remember a lot of things from the Haggadah. And when we think through the Haggadah, if we're talking about what you said at the beginning, that it's really about Yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt, what would be the logical thing that we would do on Seder night? Well, you could take out the Torah, you could take out your Chumash, and like we did last week on Shabbat HaChodesh, and you can read from Shemot chapter 12, from Perek Yud Bet, and you can read about God taking us out of Egypt. This is what happened. There was these plagues, there was the miracles, the Jews didn't have time to take out the matzah, and you could read through the story, and very good, Shloch, we've done the job. What's all this business about the Manishtana, about Dayenu, about Echad mi yodea? What's that at all got to do with the exodus from Egypt? So the question's getting more difficult now, it started off easy. Who could tell me, what's that got to do with the exodus from Egypt?
We have to feel as if you've experienced it yourself.
Ah, very good. So I agree with you. The Haggadah agrees with you. You have to live through it.
All these kind of touchy-feely things that make you feel a bit more like you're there.
Right.
If you've got to eat things you're not that keen on, like bitter herbs.
Exactly. So definitely that's part of the answer, which is, it's about the memory. That's why we've got a mitzvah to eat the matzah. You can't just talk about the matzah. You've got to eat the thing. You've got to remember what it was like. You've got to remember how they left Egypt with the matzah. But, that explains maybe why we're eating. But does that explain Echad mi yodea? Does that explain the Manishtana?
Mosaic. Because it depends which bit you're going to take. So if you take Dayenu, when it's clear that it's all about receiving the Torah, it gets you about 15 steps to get you there. And that would be a completely different answer for Manishtana or Echad mi yodea. It depends which part of the mosaic you're going to pick. But when you take the whole mosaic, it becomes an evening experience which enables some understanding, but it's not just about getting out the Torah, because it's not just about a recitation of text, because otherwise it won't be the experience. So the Haggadah has to be seen as a mosaic. The evening is a mosaic, including the food and the family arguments and all the other bits in the Afikomen. The whole thing is a mosaic.
So very good. We got another answer? You're going to suggest?
Well, mine was a slightly sort of
Go for it.
real one, you see.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
So I'm sitting at this really on the lines of isn't it going to be over? So there we are saying Dayenu. God did this, it did that, and that was enough already. Well, sure, the Saints enough already. We've got to that bit. Why have we not finished at that stage?
Why do we say mishmas and all of that? I mean, Hallel I can understand.
So you're enhancing my question, which is, why are we doing it all? What's it all about? Yes.
I assume it's just that it is to provoke exactly that question.
Right, to provoke the memory. So I'll take one more answer, and then I'll tell you what I think. Okay, go for it. Yeah.
Well, it is to provoke the questions.
To provoke the questions.
Why are we doing all this? I mean, we said that. I said it thinking, why am I doing it?
Yeah, so hopefully we're going to come up with an answer.
I'm not saying that from a cynical viewpoint. I'm just saying, it's not cynical. I don't mean from that point of view. I
But it's almost self-contradictory. If these things weren't enough, why are we then going on to say a whole load of other things which are not arguably nearly as important as the things that have been done for us that we recognise and in something like Diane.
Okay, I'll take one more answer, and then I'll suggest an idea.
For us, it's the next generation coming through. It's a wonder to see the young children repeating the traditions that my children did and that I did 60, 70 years ago. And it's a repeating, so it's not just a question. For them, it's new. It might be old for me,
Right.
but for them, it's new, and
So-
it's a repeating.
So I think that's a very good point. Well, I think the question is why these things? Why not something else? Why not just read the Torah? Why not just read the Torah? Why not just read the story? And I think part of it is definitely like we were saying. It's the memory, it's the experience. Somehow it's more engaging to hear your grandchild or your child sing the Manish Tana than it is just to laying through Shemot. But at the same time, there's something else here, which I think if you look at the Mishnah, which is the last chapter of the Mishnayot in Arvei Pesachim, it talks all about the order of the Seder and how the Seder is done. And there's a fascinating statement or fascinating argument there, which says, the Mishnah says, Matchilim begnut u'masayim b'shevach, that you start with degradation, you start with the disgrace, and you end with the praise. And it's possible to view the whole Haggadah and the story in this way, that simply speaking, what's the degradation? What's the embarrassment? That mitchila, that avadim hayinu leparo b'mitzrayim, we were slave to Paro in Egypt. That's the answer. Manish Tana, why is this night different? We were slaves to Paro, and therefore we end with the conclusion that we're free. And this is all about physical freedom. We eat physical things. We eat the matzah. We drink the wine because physically we're free. But there's another way to look at it. There's an argument in the Gemara. One answer is the other answer is what does it mean to start with disgrace? It starts with another part of the Seder, which is mitchila ovdei avodah zarah hiu avotenu, that originally our forefathers worshipped idols. And what's idols got to do with Egypt? We said Seder night is all about freedom. So viewed in this way, originally they were idol worshippers, and then God brought us close to his service. And really this is viewing it in a spiritual sense. That, what is the exodus from Egypt? It's not just a physical redemption, but it's also a spiritual redemption, which is now we're free from slavery, and now we can worship God. And that's maybe why we do Dayenu, because at the end of Dayenu, what is it? It gives us the Torah, and therefore we have the link to the Torah, we have the link to the mitzvot. And that's potentially why we do some of the other things, that Echad Miyodea, who knows one is God. What's God to do with freedom? Well, clearly God redeemed us, but also so he could bring us to him. And therefore, if you look at it this way, I think it brings together a few of your different answers, which is the Seder night is a mosaic because it's bringing together different aspects of the story. It's bringing together the aspect of the story, which is the simple redemption, the freedom from slavery, but it's also bringing an extra aspect, which is its freedom to worship God. And therefore, we can all relate to part of the story differently. So some people relate to Manish Tana, some people relate to Dayenu, an appreciation of God. Some people relate to the songs at the end. And Hallel, Jenny, you said, is that maybe this fits with the second answer, because Hallel is all about praise for God, and therefore at the end we're free, and therefore we're free to be able to praise God. And we say at the beginning of the Seder that halach ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction, this is the bread of slavery. But at the end we say, this is the bread that our forefathers had when we left Egypt, this is the bread of freedom. And really, you've got this dichotomy. You've got the two different parts of the Seder. You've got the starting with the slavery, with the gunut, with the disgrace, and you've got the ending with the shevach, with the praise, which is either the freedom or the worshipping from God. And I think if you view the Seder in this way, you can really see a progression on the Haggadah. That when you look at it afresh, you can see originally we start with, when is it supposed to be? What is it all about? Is it about the freedom physically from slavery or spiritually? And I think, if we can look at the Haggadah this way, it can really give us a new message and a new take on it, because there's so much there. There's so much of the different parts that we can remember. So hopefully that's just a couple of ideas that when you're going through the different parts of the Seder, you can appreciate potentially, the mosaic nature, the bits that are pulled together. But it's also got a deliberate order. It's following an order of the redemption, both physically and spiritually. So, just go ahead.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions that go like this at home at the moment. We'll start off with could go in any sort of direction. So it'll start off with something along the lines of, it's time to go to school now. So time to go to school now is not such a good one, actually, because we often get no's to that. But if it starts off with, for instance, can we go to the park now? No, not right now. Why not? Right? Because we've got to, whatever it is, because it's time to go to school. It's time to get ready for school. Why is it time to get ready for school? We get lots of whys and lots of questions and lots of trying to figure out what exactly is behind. A bit of a lack of trust, I feel sometimes going on at home, and a lot of, perhaps I would expect a little bit more that if I'm saying this is what we're doing now, then this is what we're doing now, right? There's not time to question and try and figure out whether that's correct or whether I've thought about it right or if there's a good reason behind it. That's what I've said we're doing, and that's what we're going to do. And we all have a little bit of a sense of that in our life that's what we should be doing. And you'd expect that if God was creating the world, right, that the same thing would be true. And beyond that, even down to halacha, right, down to Jewish law, right? How many times do you ask a rabbi a question, and instead of getting an answer back, you get back a question, right? So, well, it depends. So you tell me. So, do you planning to do it in this way, or are you planning to do it that way? Are you going to be here, or are you going to be there? Is it going to be daytime? Is it going to be nighttime? You've got to tell me. I've got to ask you a few questions before we actually figure this thing out. So Seder night, more than any other time, is the time of questions. And actually I was worried that Rabbi James was going to go there before, because the other phrase that, yes, it's true that we talk about matchel, begnut, u'masayim b'shvach, the fact that we go from the negative or from the real, downtrodden state to a state where we're talking about shevach, we're talking about the great praise to the Almighty. But the other phrase that we associate with Seder night is, particularly the Haggadah, is that we're supposed to tell the story derech she'ela u'tshuva, with questions and answers. To the extent that the Mishnah goes so far as to say that you should, in the first instance, you're supposed to ask questions to people who don't know the answers, right? So you're supposed to try and receive questions from people who want to know the answers. So you try and encourage questions from children, from youngsters, from anybody who has good questions, you try and encourage them. What if it's just you and your spouse, or you and one other person, so you ask each other questions? What if it's just you on your own? So what does the Mishnah say? You ask yourself questions. You should ask yourself questions. So derech she'ela u'tshuva, this idea of asking questions seems to be critical to the Haggadah, and to my mind the Haggadah is really a paradigm for all of Jewish education. There are so many educational lessons that we take from the Haggadah to everywhere else in our lives. So, okay, so we're going to try and offer three, hopefully more increasingly maybe complex and increasingly intricate answers as we go through. So the simplest answer is as follows: that there are people, Jews and others, who have lived in times where if you ask a question, what happens? You disappear. If you ask too many questions, then the people who ask too many questions are the ones who disappear in the middle of the night, right? Don't ask questions, get on with what you're told to do. This is the regime that we live in at the moment, right? No questions. And questions fundamentally are therefore obviously a sign of freedom, right? A sign of freedom, the ability to question, the ability to stand up and say, is this really what we're supposed to do? When a leader says, again, not getting too political, and a leader says, this is what the court system is going to look like, and everybody stands up and says, is it really, right? Then the ability to be able to stand up and say, is it really, right, is a sign that is a free country, okay? It's a free country. The people have the opportunity to ask questions. That's something to praise, okay? That at least is the ability to be able to ask those questions. That is a sign of freedom. And that's why, of course, in the Haggadah, questions are so important. They're a sign of our freedom. Okay, that's perhaps a simple answer number one. Let's go a little bit more complex. What's the best way to wake someone up? What's the best way to wake someone up? Coffee, okay, coffee. Problem is, so you've suggested coffee. I mean as follows. I walk into my children's room 6:45 in the morning, okay, they're lying down. If I were to pour coffee on them, might wake them up, okay? But I don't know if I would call it the best way, okay? I'll probably get in a bit of trouble for doing that. All right. How would you do that? Ask them a question. There we go. I noticed, right, that now Rabbi Sam has spoken, Rabbi James has spoken, the eyelids are drooping, so I thought it's going to wake people up a little bit. So I asked a question, right? Ask people a question, suddenly starts to get things going. So the first thing is that the way to wake people up, the way to wake somebody up is to ask them questions. That's what I do. I go in the morning and I ask them a question. I ask them, what day is it? What day is it? When I went in this morning, I asked them, can you tell me how many days it is till Pesach? Right? So they sat there trying to figure it out, and then they realized they were awake at that point. So they started to get dressed, right? So it's a good way to get people going. You get people thinking by asking questions. You get people interested. It starts to really begin to interest people. I'd like to tell you briefly, I'm conscious of time running away, but I'd like to tell you briefly, and I've probably told this before because I'm a big fan, and Rabbi Sachs has quoted this. Loads of people quote this story. It was an article published in the New York Times a number of years ago. It's quite famous. I'm sure you can find loads of different versions of this story. But there was a famous scientist, and unless I'm mistaken, he won the Nobel Prize for physics. His name was Isidore Rabi. Okay, Isidore Rabi was a scientist, Jewish scientist, and lived in New York for most of his life. Was born in Eastern Europe, but again made the trek, and was a very famous scientist. He was asked why he became a scientist. What was it that made you become a scientist? And his answer was as follows. He said that every day he would come home from school, and he's sure that a lot of parents ask their children, how was school today? What did you learn today? Can you tell me anything? But his parents would ask him the following. What did they ask him? Very good. Okay, you've heard the story before. Famous question. They asked him, did you ask a good question today? Or did you ask any questions today? Okay? And that instilled in him a sense that you have to ask questions. And that's what's made him a scientist. Not just any scientist, but a great scientist. Somebody who's always looking to understand more. Because we find answers when we're looking for questions, when we're actually searching. And that often is the biggest challenge I find nowadays. Is not that people are not finding the answers, but a lot of the time I find that people have stopped asking the questions. Okay, stopped asking the questions. When I talk to people, they're just not interested. You've lost that ability or that interest to actually engage in something, and that's really what we're trying to do on Seder night. We're trying to engage by asking questions. But it goes a little bit further than that. If you're a salesman, then this is also the best thing. The best way for a salesman to start is to ask a question. Okay, to start off, even if it's a simple thing, ask a person, how are you today? To ask a person, excuse me, what's the time? Right, excuse me, what's the time? Why? Because beyond just engaging interest, which is what we said before, more than that, asking questions builds a relationship. So we're going to watch a short video, which I enjoy very much, and I've probably referenced this video as well in the past, if I've spoken on this topic. But usually when I speak, it's a Shabbat, and I don't have the chance to show videos. So I want to take advantage of that tonight, and we'll see. It'll be up. Let's give it a moment. Well, let's just make sure, wait till it's on the screen. Oh, there you go. See, it's warming up. It's warming up. It'll take a moment. Do we want to turn the lights off, or can we survive? It's about 3 minutes, the video. Should we turn off a couple of lights? Is that all right? I guess while it's warming up, I'll just point out that we have a Gemara share every 2 weeks, and the favourite, or at least I'm being sarcastic here, the least favourite part of the Gemara is that we go through often a whole series of questions, and the Gemara will end with the phrase "teiku," which means we don't know the answer. So you go through all the questions, and everyone says, what's the point of asking all the questions if we don't get any answers? So let's talk about that in just a moment. We'll do one more. There we go. Perfect.
That's reading. Muy сложно, потому что reading. Τι είναι αυτό? Ένα σπουργίτι, να παιδιά. Ένα σπουργίτι. Σπουργίτι! Τι είναι αυτό? Γιατί το κάνεις αυτό το πράγμα? Μπορείς να πεις τόσες φορές είπα, είναι ένα σπουργίτι. Δεν το καταλαβαίνεις. Πού πας? Δυνατά. Σήμερα ο μικρός μου γιος που πριν λίγες μέρες έκλεισε τα τρία, καθόταν μαζί μου έξω στο πάρκο όταν ένας σπουργίτη ήρθε και κάθισε απέναντι μας. Ο γιος μου με ρώτησε 21 φορές τι ήταν αυτό και του απάντησα και τις 21 φορές ότι ήταν ένα σπουργίτη. Τον αγκάλισα κρυφερά και τις 21 φορές που μου έκανε την ίδια ερώτηση, ξανά και ξανά, χωρίς να εκνευριστώ, νιώθω στοργή για το αθώο μου οράκι.
Anybody seen the video before? Okay, great. So I didn't watch it this time because I usually cry when I watch the video. So, okay, we see that, as I said, asking questions builds a relationship. Now, as a rabbi, you probably have heard well, I've definitely heard the following phrase, and I'm sure many people have heard the following phrase, Tafreg Ashayla is treif. Anybody ever heard that before? Okay, Tafreg Ashayla is treif means not good to ask questions, okay? To me, that is a treif statement, okay? Tafreg Ashayla is treif, there's no such thing. In Judaism, to ask a question is the most powerful thing. And as a rabbi, I get asked a lot of silly questions. I always try and remind myself of the following story of a great mentor of mine, a mentor in the sense, I never met the person, but somebody who I have been inspired by his writings many, many times and many stories about him, Rav Moshe Feinstein. Moshe Feinstein was in many ways the greatest sage of his generation, certainly in America. He was the person who everybody looked to, was answering unbelievably complex questions, cutting-edge technology and science of the time, and all sorts of things he was answering questions on. When he passed away, the phone rang in his apartment. Somebody answered the phone on a Friday afternoon, and a lady she said she was phoning to speak to Rabbi Moshe. He said, he unfortunately passed away. She said, how am I going to find out what time Shabbat begins? So the man said to him, what do you mean? She said, every week I would phone up, I would ask Rabbi Moshe, I would phone him to ask him, what time does Shabbat begin this week, okay? Now, if I was, everybody, not to the people in this room, but to be perfectly honest, if I was a busy person and I kept getting the same person asking me, what time is Shabbat this week? So I would, maybe nowadays I'd send them a link. Those times maybe I'd have bought them a calendar, take it round over here you go. Here are your Shabbat times for a year, and let's come back when you have a real question to ask me, right? You don't need to take this phone call every week. But every week he would take the phone call and he would answer her, and that was it. Because questions, in addition to building interest, which we spoke about before, fundamentally questions build a relationship. They are the way that we teach the next generation, and most importantly, they are the way that we ourselves build our relationship with our own Torah and our entire tradition, right? The way that we engage with it, the way that the Torah jumps off the page, the way that it stops being simply a book on the shelf and enters into who we are and becomes a part of who we are. And really, for us to engage in the timeless conversation that is a Torah, we have to ask questions. We have to continue to ask questions, not just on Seder night, but throughout the year.
talk about number 4. We've had 3 for a running talk, so the 4th section of this evening is an opportunity for you to ask any questions you'd like to pose to the panel here. Judy.
Okay. It's a question about selling comments. Why we sell comments? The question was why. Well, principally why we sell comments.
So selling comments is a little bit of an interesting issue because it's not clear that it's the ideal practice. Right. It's not clear that it's the ideal practice. So we know that you're not allowed to own or benefit from any chametz on Pesach. So the question is, and so there's a mitzvah to destroy it. And the question becomes, well, what if I have $1,000 bottle of whiskey, or I own a factory, or whatever it is, right? Or I happen to be on a boat and I have nothing to do with my chametz, and if I get rid of it, I won't have anything to eat. So the practice developed to sell your chametz. The problem that a lot of people have with it is that many people think it's just magic, right? They don't think that it's a real sale. It's just some sort of religious ceremony that we engage in. If you think that and you haven't actually sold your chametz, and then you really are in a problem. So the way that we structure the sale is that we try and tick every box that the sale is a legally valid sale, so that you actually don't own any chametz on Pesach, and therefore you don't violate the commandment of owning chametz on Pesach. But there are a whole slew of people in Israel who will not sell their chametz. They get rid of it every year. So, question?
And we're not meant to put, as I understand, physical qualities upon Hashem. So what is an outstretched arm and a strong hand, please? Really?
Ben, you're desperate to take this question. There's a few famous answers. You could give a whole share on this one. I mean, the answer that always worked for me when this question used to bother me. Sometimes questions bother you, and you just.
This one bothers me.
Okay, great. So either the answer will work or it won't work, and if it doesn't, then you keep asking the question and looking for different answers. But the answer that helped me, and it definitely requires a little bit more thought, is as follows. So when the Torah is written, every word in the Torah is true. So when it talks about the hand of God, it's talking about something that's real. Now, we think of the outstretched hand of God in the sense that, God has a physical hand. But many Kabbalists explain it as follows, that we are given hands in order to understand when the Torah is going to describe God stretching out and reaching for something and bringing it closer, bringing it closer to Him, we were given physical attributes to our bodies to try and help us understand what that means. So we have an arm that we are able to stretch out. We have fingers so that we can understand Etzba Elokim. We have a hand so that we can understand a Yad Chazaka. And we are given these physical attributes so that we can begin to fathom what it is, what the Torah means when it describes these events. Because otherwise we would have no way to begin to link ourselves to an infinite God. So as I say, that's a simple answer that has often worked for me.
Do you have another answer?
Yeah,
It was a question, and then I'll decide which answer I like best.
Yeah. No, I'm gonna add to what Ben said, which is it's really interesting because it's a question that obviously has been asked throughout the ages because it's like a classic question. And there's an interesting debate. The Rambam, which we learned a bit of the Rambam today, Maimonides. So he rules anybody who thinks that God has a real hand or God has a real foot is a heretic. I think this is the way that most of us understand God. That God is one, He cannot be divided, He's infinite. Obviously, there's not some person upstairs with big feet. It doesn't make any sense. So the Rambam rules in his laws, in his Hilchot Deot, his laws of understanding the Torah, his laws of fundamental men. Anybody who thinks that is an Epicurus. He's a heretic. And the Ravid, throughout the Mishnah Torah, which is the Rambam's great work, the Ravid is sort of like he's sort of like nudging him in the side. Every time the Rambam says something, he argues on him. That's sort of his job. His job is to fight against the Rambam. He says, how can you say that? How can you say that anybody who thinks that God has a hand is a heretic? It says in the Torah, and people greater than you, the Rambam, thought that God had a hand. That's how they thought. So now I think we live in a very rationalistic sort of post-Rambam world where which is which is the correct way of understanding God. You know, God does not have a physical hand. But the point is, you know, Jewish philosophy, Jewish law is very restrictive. But Jewish philosophy is actually remarkably broad in terms of the views that we now view as unacceptable that in the past people did view as acceptable. And I think the answer really is, you know, just to extend this point even further, the Rambam says you can't even describe God as a something. You can't say, you know, God is powerful, God is strong, because then you're attributing finite qualities to an infinite God. The only way you can describe God is by what he's not. You know, God is not, he's not bad, he's not evil, but like Ben said, if you're going to say that God is not these things, then how are you going to relate to him? How are you going to talk to him? How are you going to have this relationship? How are you going to love God if God is this abstract, impossible thing that you can never understand? How can the finite ever connect to the infinite? And therefore, the way the Torah is written, it's written in a very corporeal way. That you know, God is, so to speak, you know, he's got emotions. He gets angry. He's upset when we don't serve him. You know, and in some ways people view this as just you know, a very childish, basic way to understand it. But the truth is how could the Dibra Torah Koloshim B'nai Adam? Everyone agrees that the Torah is written in a way we can understand it. So you know, we can only relate to God because we have those emotions. You know, and therefore, if we have those emotions, we can sort of understand what God is thinking. You know, so therefore we describe God as a king. You know, so we don't like to use too much sort of physical imagery in some places, but in other ways, you know, Anim Zemura, it's a very it uses a lot of imagery, and as Rabbi Ben said, the Kabbalists, they like to use this imagery because you can feel a lot closer connection if you can sort of picture something. So you're not supposed to have the wrong thought that, you know, God is a person, you know, or God really has these things. But in order to relate to God, you know, it's easier to relate to God, the God of the Torah, than it is to relate to the God of the philosophers, in the words of the Kuzari, that, you know, this abstract thing. So therefore, I think, you know, we can understand God better if we relate through this mode. Just add sort of one more point, that often we talk of God in two different ways. We talk of the Shekhinah, which is the divine presence, and we also talk of God with different words, some as HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, or the Or Ein Sof. These different words relate to God in different ways. You know, sometimes God is Avinu, sometimes he's the Father, sometimes he's Malkeinu, and really we relate to God often in the Beit HaMikdash when we're offering korbanot. It's sort of a spiritual, it's almost like a presence, like a cloud of God. And that's a way that we can sort of understand it and therefore connect to God. Because yes, we know really, you know, truly speaking, God is beyond all of that and we cannot understand him. But in order to connect to him and therefore feel close to him, we have to understand it in a human way.
I'm going to jump in here too. You have a phone, presumably?
Yes.
Okay. Smartphone?
Yeah.
With apps?
Yep.
Right. So if I ask you to write a text message, you're going to open up a messaging app and you're going to click keys. Are you actually writing anything? Are you actually doing anything? You're moving electrons, right? And you're affecting the app, which is really an overlay on machine code, which you don't understand and I don't understand. It's exactly the same thing, meaning we could talk about opening an app and writing on our phone, but we're not doing any of those things. We're interacting with machine code through a layer which it makes it easier for us to experience. But it doesn't affect what's actually happening. You're not actually opening up mail on your phone. You're not actually doing anything on the screen. It's just a make-believe representation of code running underneath it. So that might help you to understand.
Two questions regarding concerning the four sons.
I was worried you were going to ask about the texting app.
You have to explain.
Yeah.
First question is, how do we manage to call the Russia? Why do we call him wicked? Surely he's just exercising his prerogative to choose to not believe, and we call him wicked. So I mean that seems a bit harsh. If we're going to say you have freedom to choose to believe or not to believe, or to associate or not to associate, and yet we call him wicked for choosing not to. And my second question is, what really is the difference between the simple son and the one who doesn't know how to ask? Okay. What is the difference?
Go for it. Can I just get you to clarify the first bit, because so exercising freedom to do something doesn't mean that one of them is incorrect. Meaning, you know, I might exercise my freedom to hit the person next to me, right? But you'd be pretty unimpressed if I did that. So it's not the freedom that's the problem, is it?
Okay, why do we label him as evil for
Because we think he's evil.
Sorry?
We think he's evil. I mean, this is something that English Jews don't like to talk about.
Yeah, that's what I was just trying to drill down. The real question is how can we be
We
how
don't
can we
like
be
calling
for a
people
belief?
evil, right? Unless they do something heinous. You know, heinous things we're okay with calling evil. But the Torah has a very particular worldview and is unapologetic about it. And, you know, attaches a very strident, you know, negative moral attribution to this person who doesn't act in the way we want him to. It doesn't, there's a difference between limiting his free will, he can do whatever he wants to. We think that that's incorrect. So we label him a Russia. Right? We want to know how to relate to this person. A Russia ultimately, a label ultimately, what does it serve us? What does it do? It allows us to understand what is our relationship to this person. Right? And again, do labels encapsulate the entirety of the person? Absolutely not. Right? The map is not the territory. But it enables us to have a starting point. And if this person is rejecting our tradition and everything that we hold dear, we can't but think he's wicked. At least the Torah can.
So they always say there's 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So you've got 3 rabbis here. So I'm sure we can come up with about 5 opinions here. So I'm gonna suggest another answer, which is it's interesting. The whole story of the 4 sons, as I sort of mentioned, it doesn't really fit with the Exodus story necessarily. It's not really about going out from Egypt. And I think one way of viewing it is that first of all, they're all based on different times in the Torah that it says, and your son will ask you saying, Ve'gada talavincha, your son will ask you saying, Mazot, what's this? And it's interesting, if you look through it, the answers in the Haggadah are not actually the answers the Torah gives us. The Torah gives specific answers, this is what you should say to him. And the Haggadah gives different answers. And really, I think it's a way of the rabbis teaching us a sort of message, a sort of drush, a drusha, that we take the words in the Torah, that these are the 4 times it says so, that you should say to your son asks you, and we're going to draw a lesson from it, which is that there's different types of people, there are different types of people in the world. You've got the wise son, the son who wants to be involved, who wants to ask questions, and then you've got the Russia, the wicked son, or the challenging son who wants to say, which is this is not the plain reading of the Torah, that he says, everybody always asks, how is it that both the wise son and the wicked son both say to you, and yet with the wise son we view that as a positive, and the wicked son we view it as a negative? So you can come up with an answer and say, well, one is he's challenging, one is it's the way he's asked, but I think really what it is it's the Torah is telling us that there are different types of people, and there's no guarantee that even the most righteous parents can have children who come out all differently. Avram and Sarah, they had Yitzchak and Ishmael, and Yitzchak, he has, Esav and he has Yaakov, the same house, the same parents, and they come out very differently. And the Torah is telling us that there's different ways to relate to the different sons. So, you've got to each teach them according to their way. So in Mishnah and Proverbs it says, Chanach lenar pidarko, you should teach the son according to his way. So the wise son, he wants to know, so therefore you should teach him the laws of the Afikomen. The wicked son, where potentially he's challenging, so what's the response? If he's challenging, then actually you need to give him a very firm response. Haket chinav, and you say to him, it's because of this. You try and sort of get the message across in a way that he will understand. If you're talking about the Afikomen, he doesn't understand. And you ask the difference between the simple son and the son who doesn't know how to ask. So the simple son, seemingly, the simple reading of the text is, he just says, what's this? He can ask, but he doesn't understand very deeply. So you need to give him a very basic answer, which is, God took me out of Egypt. Whereas the son who doesn't know how to ask, he's so far removed or he's so young that he can't even ask the question. And therefore it's telling you, you need to open it up for him. So I think, viewed in this way, it's not telling you that there's necessarily a typology of a person who's purely bad. We don't believe anyone's purely bad. Anybody can do teshuvah and can therefore come to repent and to return. It's saying everyone's welcome at the Seder, and you need to teach them in different ways. That's why I've got different parts of the Seder. And therefore the wicked son, right now he might be wicked, but therefore, if you give him if you teach him the proper way, then maybe he'll come back. And in some ways the wicked son is easier to relate to, because he's engaging, he's challenging, and therefore you can actually have a discussion. It's the son that doesn't ask, or potentially the son who's not even there, who's even more of a challenge. So I think it's potentially, I'm not sure if I answer your question, but it's a different way of looking at the story, and therefore sort of what it's trying to teach us on Seder night, the why we put it here, and I think it's a focal part. Everyone always asks about the 4 sons, even though seemingly it's got nothing to do with Egypt, because that's sort of how you should be telling the story. Like Rabbi Ben said, there's this question and answer, and therefore teaching people in different ways according to their sort of understanding.
Did we answer the second question?
So I think I tried to answer, which is the difference between the simple and but go for it.
Well, no, I think the easiest answer, the second question, I think the easiest answer is that in one case they're coming forward and in one case they're not. Again, if we're looking at these as paradigms, sometimes people would come forward and ask very simple questions, and other times you know, what we've got to do is try and notice the people who are just sitting on the side and not asking the questions, and try and find a way to open the door for them, right? It says, I think it's patach lo, right? It means you open the door for them, right? You try and bring them in. You know, you've got to actually go there and open the door for them to try and bring them in. I think that's the idea.
Okay, so I have two questions, very different ones. So, as a maths loving child, the bit where 10 blades became 250 by some spurious means always amused me. Now I'm getting older, and every year we read through it, and I think no idea what's going on here. why do we start off with 10 and end up with 250? And does it matter, I suppose, is my other question. And my second very different question is, bearing in mind that we all live now in a very metropolitan way, why is it that still, through an accident of my birth, I don't get to eat a lentil during Pesach or a bean or any other such things? What I don't understand is why nothing has changed, because I don't think not eating legumes is biblical.
Not even rabbinic.
Again?
Well, yeah.
So there you go.
Okay.
Several hours worth of stuff, I'm sure, but they're questions that I always go through my mind.
Anyone take? I'm happy to take or not.
I don't mind. I'll take the
second question.
I'll take the second question.
Is that what you want to do?
I don't know. Well, you can take the second question. All right. I'll take the second question first.
I can add on.
I'll take the second question first. So, Lisa, you're talking about kitniot, which is that kitniot. So, kitniot is a whole shiur unto itself.
Yeah.
Essentially, a kitniot is a later invention, which is the Torah prohibits us from having chametz. At some point in history, there's different reasons given for the gezerah, the sort of decree of kitniot. One is people might have got confused between sort of, you know, the rice and the flour. You know, one is that maybe they use the same bags, rice and flour at that time. And one is, you know, it's maritime. Maybe someone will see you cooking a stew and it will look a lot like chametz, and therefore they'll think you do the wrong thing. For whatever reason, you know, in Ashkenazi tradition, in those circles, it became pasnish, you know, no kitniot on Pesach. So I think, so that's why Ashkenazim have the gezerah, have this decree against it. And Sephardim never took it upon themselves. Okay, so your question is really a wider question, which is sort of around the halachic process and tradition, which is sort of why, okay, we understand in time, you know, in the midst of time 1,000 years ago, certain communities were having kitniot and certain communities weren't. And why is it now we still obliged to follow those laws as opposed to a Sephardi who would not be? And this is a really big topic in terms of halachic process. But I think generally what you see is that each generation, it sort of adds on the previous generation, but you don't tend to detract terribly often. So let me give you an example. So the Torah sets you certain rules. So, you know, on Pesach you can't have chametz, and, you know, on Erev Pesach you can't have chametz. The rabbis came along and said, well, even an hour earlier don't have chametz, because, you know, you might come to eat chametz before, you know, and they start making certain decrees, you know, everyone's favorite, the second day Yom Tov, that, you know, we didn't know which day it was, so therefore we're going to add another day of Yom Tov, you know, which everyone always asks, why can't we get rid of second day Yom Tov? And really you see this evolve over time, that you have the written tradition, you have the oral tradition, so the Mishnah, which is the earlier sources, and the Gemara builds on the Mishnah, and the Rishonim, the early commentators, build on the Gemara, and the Achronim, the later commentators, build on the early commentaries. And it's really sort of like a river sort of flowing downstream. And if you were to start sort of going back and challenging what was, you know, done, you know, thousands of years ago, then Judaism would start to look very different. So there's almost like an unwritten code within the oral tradition that certain generations, they sort of accept what was done previously. So once you get to the times of certain of the sages of the Gemara, they don't challenge what was in the Mishnah. They can only interpret the Mishnah, they can't challenge it. And similarly, the Rishonim, the later commentaries in the Middle Ages, don't challenge what was in the Gemara, what was in the Talmud, but rather they accept it and they interpret it and they just challenge what was the interpretation and which is the way we rule. And I think similarly we see in Kitniot that, you know, once something has been accepted upon us as a sort of, as a neder, as a sort of vow, or as a practice, it's very difficult to change it. And the only way you could really change it is if you had a court of Sanhedrin representing all the Jews who would come along and say, let's not do this anymore. There are many commentators who say, actually, I'd love to get rid of kitniot. It doesn't make any sense. It's very restrictive. But what can I do? You know, we've accepted it, so we've accepted it. And I think that's part of potentially, you know, the
the side that we always say about the Haggadah, that maybe it's not the most logical way to do things, but this is the way the traditions evolved. This is how our parents did it and their grandparents did it for many generations. And that's part of what gives Judaism staying power, which is that, you know, we build on the tradition and we don't really take away from it, except in very rare cases. So I know that helped, but that's essentially sort of how the halakhic process works, and therefore, if you came from a certain community, that's sort of become incumbent upon you, whereas not if you came from another community.
So I have to jump in because I don't agree with what he said. I'm just gonna, maybe the broad strokes, but the finer points I think need to be fleshed out just a little bit. There are categories of law. What you're essentially asking is a legal process question. Okay? So we have to be very clear when it comes to the legal process. Judaism is very clear about delineating authority and certain scope of law. Okay? And the waters are muddied a little bit more because the same words are used. So minhag in this instance, but they're used in different legal contexts, and therefore will take on different legal authorities based on who's using those terms and in what sense. Okay. Without going into a lot of detail, the reason you don't eat kidneyot is because you don't eat kidneyot, right? Social pressure essentially is the answer to your question. It's the same reason why I don't have 2 wives. Okay. That's not a Talmudic decree. So therefore, it doesn't carry. Meaning, if we're locating the authority of the rabbis, then we're locating their authority in the Torah. But only certain rabbis possess that authority, and that authority ended with the closing of the sealing of the Talmud. So anybody post-Talmud doesn't really have the authority to tell you what to do, and to tell you how to interpret Judaism. What's happened is, pardon? Right. So kibbutz, right, is a decree, but it's post-Talmudic. And just like the decree not to have multiple wives is post-Talmudic. But why don't I have multiple wives? Because it's called cherem derabbeinu gershom. If I would do such a thing, I would be excommunicated. So social pressure is keeping me from marrying 2 women, and social pressure is keeping you from eating kidneyot. But if you're going to ask me, and I think we have to be clear about this, if I eat kidneyot in my own home without publicizing it, because publicizing it might violate another issue, which is violating custom of a particular place. Well, let's say you had kidneyot in your own home and nobody was the wiser. Would you have done anything wrong? The answer is absolutely not. Legally, there's nothing wrong with that. Socially, societally, there might be, but those are 2 separate things. We have to be clear about those delineations, and there's absolutely no argument about that. One is law, and one is custom in the sense of norms, but not in the sense of law as being either rabbinic or biblical.
So it's good because we get.
Pardon?
Well, we'll come back to the first question because Rabbi James gave his answer and Rabbi Sam got to disagree, so I get to disagree now with Rabbi Sam. At least on part of it. So I think it's worth. I want to come back. I don't want to forget this. I want to come back to your phrase that you used, an accident of birth, which I'll come back to in just a moment. But we can debate this afterwards, but I definitely don't agree with the statement that if you were to eat kidneyot in your own home and nobody were to find out about it, that you wouldn't be doing anything wrong. I think 100% would be doing something wrong. Whether or not, what level it's on, is it the same as eating chametz? That I fully agree with. Definitely not the same as eating chametz. Is it the same as, I don't know, eating... Correct, not the same as all sorts of things which we might do wrong. How high of a level is it? Okay, maybe it's a pretty low level, but I definitely think it is doing something wrong because it is. Okay, so fundamentally, following minhag is a trust in the system, and to not do that is showing a lack of trust in the system. Now, again, it's a lower level of trust, right? It's not the same, doesn't have the same ramifications, and I think it's always important that we understand, as Rabbi Sam, well, as both Rabbanim have pointed out, that there are different levels of things, and that not everything carries the same weight, and actually many times there are mistaken minhagim. There are family. Well, I'll give you one example. Every time I go to a shiva where someone says, "I know I'm not allowed to say thank you," right? Unless I'm mistaken, that is a totally made up thing. Okay, there's no such custom not to say thank you at the shiva, and although everyone feels like they're doing the worst. They'd almost rather eat chametz on Pesach than they would to say thank you when they're sitting shiva, right? Nothing could be further from the truth. Whereas eating kidneyot, so yeah, you're right, it's not the worst thing in the world, but I think it's also, I guess it brings me back to your phrase about an accident of birth. Part of being Jewish is also we don't believe in such a thing as accident of anything. And if we're part of a certain family, if we're from a certain tradition, then that is a part of our makeup in a sense. It's there to help us to connect to who came before us. It's there to help us connect to our traditions. There to help us ultimately, all of it, there to help us connect to our Creator. And so in the same way that we don't believe it's an accident that we end up living in a certain place, that we're here. And why does our shul, this is also a question that comes up a lot, why does our shul say all of these long paragraphs and the shul over there doesn't say any of those long paragraphs, right? Also comes back to similar questions, right? That we have established traditions and just to throw them out all of a sudden needs to be done carefully, needs to be done with significant thought. You can respond back.
We'll be here all night.
Okay, great. We'll talk afterwards.
So let me just answer Lisa's first question before we take another one, which was about the calculations. So I'll give you the straightforward answer. That I think is the straightforward answer, which is so the first opinion. The first opinion is that in Egypt there was 10 plagues, and at the sea there was 50 plagues, and we know the maths of that because in Egypt it was the finger of God, and in the sea it was the hand of God. Okay, so that one's sort of understandable. And what's it telling us? It's telling us that you thought there were a lot of plagues in Egypt. The splitting of the sea was even more miraculous. That was even more a higher level. But then why is this debate about really each plague in Egypt was 4, each plague in Egypt was 5? So that's really where the question comes from. So the answer is a somewhat technical answer, but there's a verse in Psalms, in Tehillim, that describes all the plagues, or at least the plague of the hail, the barad, that came down, that was, this very powerful plague that had, the ice on the outside and the fire on the inside, and it describes it with these different ways, that it was, it was like a band of emissaries of evil and all the different things that we describe. And it's got 4 or 5 different descriptions for how terrible this plague was. And therefore, the other 2 opinions, they basically want to expand the number of plagues, and therefore they say each plague, that wasn't just for the plague of hail, as described in Psalms, but each plague had these different aspects in it. And therefore each plague was either 4 or 5, and therefore in Egypt it was either 40 or 50, and by the sea therefore even 200 or 250. So that's a simple reading, but I think the question was, well, what's it trying to tell us? So I've heard two answers about it. One is that sort of showing us God's power and his might and his control over the world, which we sort of see throughout the plagues, that they demonstrate to Egypt there's sort of a lesson that you think that Ra, whichever other god controls the world. No, it's it's really Hashem. It's he's the one who can turn water to blood, or he can frogs. It's this gradual lesson. That one analogy I like is that each of the plagues, they start on the ground. If you think the blood and the frogs, they all come from the ground, and then gradually you sort of look up a bit more. The next plagues are sort of the animals. The wild animals and the animals dying, and then finally the plagues are from the heaven. You have to sort of look up and appreciate it, that it's the plagues of the darkness and the hail and the sort of the locusts from heaven. And there's sort of an educational message. So it's sort of teaching us more about the plagues. And there's another idea, which is that God, it says in the Torah that I am God, your healer, and Yashem Rofecha, and that all the plagues that I brought on Egypt, I'm not going to bring on you. So the more plagues there were in Egypt, the less plagues that we're going to get, is sort of the other answer. So therefore, the more we could say it was bad for them, the more we could say, well, God's going to sort of sort us out. So those are the answers I've heard about that.
You mentioned before about the influence of the Ashkenazi rabbis in the Middle Ages. To take that back to the Seder service itself, so just before the third cup of wine, pour out thy wrath, which all the commentators say that's who actually the Crusades, because on the way to services, or what better practice than ours. Would you find that phrase then in the Mizrahi Seder? In other words, is the whole Haggadah unified throughout the Jewish world, or are there differences in that?
I'll take another one of them. The core of the Haggadah is the same everywhere, which is it's based on the Mishnah at the end of Arei Pesachim that describe the 4 cups of wine. It describes the leaning. It describes how you start, and that we all expand from the phrase of the Bikurim and the sort of the fruits there. So the core parts of the Seder are the same. What you see is that different communities and rabbis over the time, they seem to incorporate things that were relevant to them, and were relevant to them in their time. So a famous example is everybody talks about Rabbi Elazar and the rabbis who were sort of dining there in Bnei Barak, and what were they doing?
And one popular theory is, they were plotting against the Romans because they were sort of the enemy at the time. There are various other theories. I heard a share today that when it says Arami Oved Avi, that this is Aramean, this is sort of an anagram for Romi, for Rome, and they were sort of plotting against Rome. You sort of see in different generations, the rabbis sort of incorporated their enemies, or the Bechol Dor Vador, in each generation, our enemies rise up to kill us, and God saves us from them, and therefore we sort of incorporate this. And so in the times of the Crusades, it might be Shvach Hamatcha, pour out your wrath. I'm not sure if it's a late tradition or not. It would fit in with that general phrase, that general idea that we're not just remembering Egypt, but we're remembering in every generation how God sort of saved us. But I think it is generally sort of what we say, because it's also a harbinger of Elijah the prophet. And when we say, even in a biblical sense, we're going to read this Shabbat and Shabbat HaGadol, how Eliyahu will come, there might be this great war, and will sort of be redeemed. And therefore we're saying, there have been plenty of times in Jewish history where sadly, we have been persecuted. And we don't forget that. So yes, it's not all about sort of wrath and hatred, but there is an idea of sort of, it may be not for us, but God will at least, make sure that justice is meted out in the end. Very it's just the actual question of whether it will be in the Sephardi Haggadah. I don't think it appears in every Haggadah, and as Rabbi James said, certain things will, certain things won't. But it's worth. I find this every year that depending on which Haggadah people are using, you'll have differences. So we do have, particularly around Hallel, there is a classic. Disagreement as to how exactly you conclude Hallel, depending on whether you're Ashkenaz or more Hasidic Haggadahs. The way you set up the Seder plate is also different between whether you're Ashkenaz or more Hasidic, and Sephardi may have its own one. I'm really not such an expert in Sephardi traditions, but yeah, you'll find all sorts of little differences.
The song's the same.
But most of it's the same.
Yeah,
the core is all the same. So there's
surprisingly
Haggadah I've got
that
does have both nuschaot, and there's a difference in the language of the bracha. There's a difference where you finish Hallel, but essentially besides that, it's all the same. It is something unified throughout the Jewish world. It is a very early source that sort of predates potentially that split. And just as an opportunity to argue back with Rabbi Sam on the previous question, which was about sort of this Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom, that what was accepted by the whole Jewish world. So in a basic sense, it was the Talmud. Everyone agrees that we accepted the Talmud, the Bavli, but what was also accepted was the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, which is 1,000 years later, which is by Rabbi Yosef Karo. And then the Ramah, he wrote the Ashkenazi gloss where we differ. And the idea of that was really to try and say, okay, we've got separate traditions, but we're one Jewish people. We're not that different. And generally speaking, everything that was written in the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, there are very, very few exceptions, was accepted by the whole Jewish world. And included in that is that the Ramah writes against that we cannot have kibbutz. And therefore, I think it's more than just social pressure. Yes, Sam's right, it's not got the same status as a decree from the rabbis of the Talmud, but it's more like it is a proper excommunication that, it's not just the same that you could do it at home and therefore it will be all fine. It's got a lower status than that, but it is still have been something that's accepted by the whole Jewish world, and therefore something we're not permitted to sort of just do away with.
Final question from you.
So I have this thing that comes up every year for me, particularly when our children were small, and it was myself and my husband and my 2 boys, and obviously there's four sons, and I did feel it incumbent upon me to say something about women, because obviously all these boys thinking, right, representations of ourselves, and then now I've got a granddaughter who isn't quite old enough to ask questions yet, but I'm guessing that's going to come. And what do you suggest I say to her when she says, "What about me in this Haggadah? How do I relate to this?"
First,
Well, I mean, there's a very easy answer to this
Yeah.
question, and that is that banim means children,
yeah,
not sons.
we should stop.
The plural of any word in Hebrew which refers to both genders is automatically phrased in the male version of the plurality. But that includes women as well. So banim means children.
But it's not talking about the wise children.
It is. It's just a. There's the problem is that we're always reading translations and we don't focus on the Hebrew. But the word banim means 4 children. That's what it means. It's just a yeah.
I mean,
Meaning,
If
again,
you,
the
looked,
reason.
if you looked at the underlying verses, you would find that it only talked about a male child.
What, no more than.
Vikata bincha, right? To your child.
How
But,
would you say that? Again, it's the same thing.
no, bincha, right? You would say.
Doesn't say.
But, I know, it says bincha, right? But the problem is also, but this is just such a broader question. Women have no obligation to learn Torah at all. And the question is, what does that mean? And is it tempered? And yes, there are some people who say they have more obligation than others, but that's a broad, and it's just a much bigger question that I think anybody could do justice to right now. I would say that there's nothing wrong with including them as much as you want to include them.
I think we should go further than that. It's not nothing wrong. They are the Haggadah. The mitzvah of the Haggadah applies to women as much as it applies to men. I don't know what I'm missing here. So the Haggadah speaks to men and women and boys and girls and everybody. Yeah.
I think there's a, maybe we have to have a look at the translation.
I think the problem is that we've grown up in Western society, which was a very patriarchal society. So the problem is that we've had thousands of years of convincing ourselves that we have lived among male-dominated societies, and we've convinced ourselves that that's what Judaism is. But as I said, I think this is a broader question generally. That many of the times, all the things that we attribute to Judaism are often things that have become culturally accepted in the UK or in Eastern Europe or wherever they were accepted over the last few hundred years, and they're not always built into this. Sometimes they are, and then there's questions to be asked as to, is that meaningful, or is it just something that we've just created over the years or not? I don't mean to, maybe I'm overstating it, I don't mean to be saying that Judaism doesn't distinguish between genders. It very much does. I'm not denying that at all. That's 100% true. But I do think that a lot of the time that we have a feeling that, that something is speaking to women or the men more than it's speaking to women is because of our culture over centuries as well, which is not necessarily part of the Torah.
Yeah, just to add to that point, I think it's a really good point, which is if you look at what was society like the time the Haggadah was being written, or the time of the Torah, it was a very male-centric society. That in that sense that men were the educated ones, and women didn't have the same opportunities to learn or study. And even amongst men, it was only really a very few proportion of the people who actually studied. Most people were sort of farmers, or they didn't necessarily have that opportunity, and therefore tradition reflects what the society was around them, which is that often men were studying and women didn't have the same opportunities. And now we live in a time where thankfully women do have the opportunities to learn and to study. And Sam's teaching a course that my wife is part of, which is the first of advanced women's learning course in the UK, which I think is an excellent thing. And I think the fact is we need to up the level of women's education. And I've been saying through understanding the translation, it's not necessarily that it's for men. Most of Judaism is for both. There are some things which are just men, there are some things which are just women. And actually, through increasing the level of education and knowledge, we can make people feel more included and therefore more part of the conversation, which we have to accept historically wasn't always the case.
If I can end on a subversive note, I'll end with a question. Why are we allowed to change the tradition of not teaching women Torah, but we're not allowed to change the tradition of kinyot? The times have changed. That's my question for you to answer.
Well, on that note, I think we've drawn things. Hope you all join me in thanking these three great women for their excellent great Torah this evening, and wish you all a chance to share with someone. Anyone would like to finish off the comments and some more tea and coffee, most welcome.